Welcome to The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies in Modern. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the one and only Shane Beeps.
Stan, how are you? You ready to talk about some Modern Magic the Gathering?
Oh, I look forward to this day every day of the week. Except on Mondays, in which case I'm just happy to be here. Also with us here in Chicago, it's the Godfather, Dave Harburger.
So excited to join you to talk about the three things that London does well: fish, chips, and mulligans.
In it.
In it.
Last but not least, it's the Warden in town, Zach Callahan.
I don't want to give away too much, but I do think the death of mid-range may have been greatly exaggerated.
Ooh, a tease. Zach is so good with the teases lately.
56%, baby.
On this week's episode, we do a breakdown of GP Sao Paulo, then dive into the new Mulligan rule, which we've been testing in Magic Online leagues. Plus, we look at the Modern Mox results, which have had the London Mulligan in effect. But first, some housekeeping. Thanks are in order for friends of the show, Whoosh and Chris Butchine. We appreciate the very friendly reviews you guys left us on our iTunes.
And also, guys, if you didn't hear, on our last episode, we are going to be launching our Patreon in the coming weeks. Many of you have been asking for when we're going to do it, and it's soon. So if you aren't really aware, Patreon is a website. It lets listeners like you all support content creators like us, and it's through a subscription model. So we spend the time and some money out of pocket to create the podcast, and you give us some cash back, as much or a little as you want. Of course, the show is always free, right? So we're not going to charging you for the show. We just want to figure out a way to get benefits and rewards back to you who want to support the Dive Down. And so last week, we released a survey for everybody, and we got a good response for that, but we definitely want some more. If you haven't filled out the survey yet, it's going to be in the show notes for this episode. It's also pinned on our Twitter, which is @TheDiveDown, all one word. And really what we want to find out in this short little survey is what kind of Patreon benefits are most appealing to the listeners. So, we're thinking things like patron posts, where people like you can ask us questions, access to maybe a patron Slack channel, maybe some custom designed sleeves or deck boxes or playmats or stickers or pins or hats or shirts, all that kind of stuff. So we want to know what listeners are interested in so we can craft the Patreon campaign for you. So please just take the 2-3 minutes, click the link. It's either going to be on Reddit, on Twitter, in the show notes, and let us know what you think.
We welcome all input in our survey. So even if you can't support a Patreon financially, all of our listeners are invited to participate. And also, if you've already taken it, you do not need to take it again. But if you haven't, the survey takes just about 2 minutes, so you could probably do it on the toilet. Not saying you should, just saying you could.
What such power we all have in this modern world.
Last week, we had mentioned that we have some prototype playmats floating around Chicago.
Yeah, and also, we'll be designing some extra, depending on what the results of the survey are, we'll socialize designs of the whatever swag we make with the community before we go out and make anything. So maybe we'll do some voting, some polls. It all depends on when I have some time to design sweet sleeves and deck boxes and hats and things like that.
Yeah, we're putting a lot on Dave's shoulders here, but, he only has 2 kids and a, busy gig, so he's got all the time in the world.
It's all about the love.
I would like some prototypes of fanny packs, if you don't mind. I don't know if we're going to produce them, but I want to imagine what one would look like. Keep your deck in it, keep your dice in it. I don't know.
Is it too late to add that to the survey?
It's absolutely not.
Because, man, now that you mention it, I really wish that I was a fanny pack wearer at tournaments. You put your deck in it. Yeah, it's a perfect size for a deck, a pen, some dice. I don't need this big backpack.
A notepad.
Real talk. I used to do that. So I used to put just 60 cards, single sleeved. I guess there was a sideboard into one of those like really cheap Ultra Pro plastic boxes that fold into themselves, into a fanny pack, bike to the card shop. The only problem is no room for playmat. And we've got these beautiful dive down playmats.
Yeah.
So
you can wear one of those like tubes that art students have when they're bringing their presentation to class.
Yeah, like an architecture
guy.
Or lady.
So maybe these tubes should be designed to also hold a deck box. We've got a lot in R&D right now, but the Dive Down Swag Nation is growing.
Yeah.
A little peek into the minds at work here.
All right, so let's hop over to Zach with this week's breakdown. What do you got for us at the news desk?
So this week we'll be looking at the Modern Grand Prix that took place at Magic Fest Sao Paulo. So this event was only text coverage, so not a ton of info, not a ton of fun, sweet plays to look at.
Boo.
So yeah, I know.
Burns.
It's always really fun when they have them. You get to see some cool things, and like we'll send each other short clips, stuff like that, about really interesting plays or sequences.
Yeah, I mean the one thing that we get out of these tournaments generally is a report on who went undefeated on day one, and it was a pretty interesting list.
Only 3 decks.
That's about what you get nowadays, I think.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the way the field is right now, and we can talk about that later, where it seems to be a lot of decks coalescing at the top with a lot of singletons at the bottom. So the day one undefeateds were Is It Phoenix, Boggles, and a Jeskai Control, which we have not seen in a little bit.
Yeah. I also would really love to see the list that the Jeskai Control player was running that they managed to go undefeated with. Unfortunately, there was a big archive of deck submissions released from this, and that was one of the ones that was not in the archive.
Oh, because of course.
Because they submitted a paper deck list instead of an electronic one.
Oh, is that why that spreadsheet they released of all the day 2 decks isn't complete? Is because they're not the electronic ones?
That's what the note that came with it said.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay.
Maybe we can do some hunting detective work, maybe with the help of Dive Down Nation.
Yeah.
Try to find this player.
We can do like Toby Henke did with like his giant garbage bag of deck lists.
Just running up to strangers in the street, pulling them backwards and saying, "Is it you?
Are you the control? How many cryptic commands were you running? Was it 3? Was it 4?
How many ousts?
I'm sorry, it's Oost. So moving on to day 2 of the tournament. So 227 players made day 2, which it seems like a whole lot to me.
Yeah, it's like 3 times as many as like an SCG Open.
Yeah,
So-
it's always a good reminder that Grand Prix really are bigger than the SCG Opens. I mean, the SCG events are awesome, so no shade there, but the GPs are always quite almost an order of magnitude bigger in some ways.
So we're going to take a quick peek at the day 2 metagame breakdown here. So in first place, we had Is It Phoenix with close to 13% of the overall game, 12.8. Grixis Death Shadow coming in at 10%. Tron at 8.4. Hardened Scales and The Rock both at 6.6. And then Humans at 6.2 with all their decks below 5%.
Wow.
Yeah, it's falling back to earth.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Let's not get
More or
too
less.
crazy yet. It's one event where it fell back to earth.
Yeah.
It's one event and it still is
I
the
mean,
number 1 deck. So
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good to see the potential for Phoenix returning to the pack, but I wouldn't take this one result as being a trend in any way.
Sacrosanct, if you will.
Why do you think Grixis Shadow is 10% of the room here? Like, it doesn't seem like it's doing anything particularly special against the wider metagame. Is it just a quality deck? Do people just like it?
I think one thing is that it performed very, very well at GP Calgary in the hands of Sam Party, and I think that a lot of people probably picked that up because he's a well-known pro, well-known competitor at events like this, and so I can imagine people being inspired by that. I also just think that this is one of those things where it's the churn of the second deck in the order of the metagame is just going to kind of change over and over again, even if Phoenix stays consistent at the top. I don't personally feel like there's anything super special that Grixis Death Shadow does against Phoenix particularly, but I could be wrong about that. It just feels like it's another deck that's competitive in the meta, just kind of having its moment. What do you think, Stan? After playing a little GDS lately.
Yeah, I would agree that it's not necessarily doing anything special, and it didn't make to top 8 either. So to me, that could be any number of factors. Like maybe there's just a bunch of Grixis Shadow players in the room, the way that a lot of people like bringing mid-range to tournaments, and no one wants to play Jeskai Control anymore. So this is one place all those Jeskai players may be going. It's hard to extrapolate what causes a meta share for a single tournament.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think it's cool that it's the second most popular deck, even though perhaps some of the numbers that speak to its performance aren't all that impressive. But we'll get into that later.
So the top 8 from this event, we had Tron coming in first. Pretty stock list, nothing too exciting there. In second place, though, we had a pretty interesting humans build. The sideboard choices were a little deviant from the norm. Typically, humans is running a sideboard that's almost entirely creatures, and this one had Chalice of the Void in addition to Dismember and Damping Sphere.
Yeah, one thing I noticed looking at this list is that it's cut back on Ancient Ziggurat, so there's only 2 of them in the main, so that should help you a little bit in casting non-creature spells.
Yeah, we have another humans list in third, also with the Sphere and Dismember in the sideboard. No Chalices for this one, though. Fourth, we have Boggles. Pretty stock list, nothing too interesting there. Fifth, we have a Titan deck, and this one has an interesting sort of red-green mid-range package. It has a main deck Inger of the Gods, 2 of them, in fact.
Mm-hmm. And it's a couple Flame Slash. What?
Yeah, exactly. It almost looks like the attempts I've tried with red-green Scred in the past.
Sometimes Titan Shift will run like these red spells for removal.
Interesting. I don't think I've seen that before, but I definitely believe you.
I think I noticed it come up a bit when we were doing research for the old Amulet Titan episode.
Oh, it's so long in the past I can't even remember.
It's been a minute.
Sixth place, we have the little burb that could, and Phoenix is there. And this one, I don't know if it's interesting or worth noting at this point, but there was a Ral Zarek, the new one, the big Ral, in the sideboard.
Noted.
Yeah, got to get that value somewhere.
Seventh place, another Phoenix deck. And then finally, pulling up the rear, we have Burn. And this one had both Skewer and Light Up the Stage main, and it was the red-white build, not the red-black build.
Ooh. Yeah, a couple Light Up the Stage just for the card advantage.
Nice to see something other than Phoenix win, right?
Yeah, Tron, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as much as I don't want to play Tron myself, I respect all the people who choose to assemble it on a weekly basis, so I think that's great.
If memory serves me correctly, you walked off the set of our Tron show, so...
Yeah, I mean, we were under intense contract negotiations at the time, so there was other stuff going on that wasn't apparent to the listeners, but...
A little peek behind the dive-down curtain for the nation.
You, too, can get dive-down shower curtains through our Patreon.
So now we're going to look at some data provided by Frank Karsten on the Day 2 win rates from this tournament.
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat how much I love Channel Fireball giving us more access to information that we've really had before when it comes to just hard data from their modern GPs. So he let us see what these top archetypes were doing on the Day 2. And so we have Izzet Phoenix at a mere 50.6, 81 and 79. Grixis Shadow at 45.7, so it definitely fell off in the Day 2 there. As Stan mentioned, didn't make the top 8. And only one copy in the top 16, I believe. And that went 59 and 70. Tron, 56.7 at a 68-52 win rate. Hardened Scales, 55%, 52 and 42. Green Black Rock, 41.6%, doing mid-range things. Mid-range is dead, still sub 50% at 37 and 52.
Move along.
And Humans, 68%, completely outrageous, defying everything we know about Modern. This is clearly an aberration. I mean, decks don't run 68% for any length of time. Not even the best decks that Modern has seen. So, but still, that's an outrageous performance by the Humans players on Day 2.
Yeah, I mean,
that really
second
is.
and third place for human players.
Yeah, I mean, it explains why there were 2 in the top 8 and 2 more in the top 16. So that 4 of the top 16 decks were Humans.
Humans has been doing well. We might mention this later, but we saw Humans do really well online over the weekend as well. So Humans is killing it. The game, the meta game does shift, does change.
So what do you guys think of the results of this as we're going into the into the Mythic Championship? There's one more Grand Prix between the recording of this and the Mythic Championship. Anything change here for you? Worrisome? Any alarmist Phoenix takes that anybody wants to give this week, or do we feel good because Phoenix didn't win and we can talk about Tron instead?
I think that any of the decks that Change is listed are perfectly fine decks to bring to a big tournament. I would hedge that with bring a deck that you know and are good at playing, but I think Phoenix versus Death Shadow, Tron, Hardened Scales, the Rocker Humans are all fine decks to sleeve up and bring.
Yeah, I mean they're the class of the class of the format. The only ones I would throw onto the list would probably be Amulet Titan and Burn would probably be the other ones that deserve to be on a list somewhere.
You guys are forgetting about Dredge, which is
I forgot about Dredge. Yeah, where's Dredge?
Drastically underplayed. That's why.
Maybe all the GDS players were Dredge players that moved over. Maybe it's a local thing. Who knows?
Yeah, there are regional, country-wide metagames. I'm sure the metagame we'll see over in Asia next week will be a little bit different than this, too.
It's so weird and interesting that Grixis Shadow with a 45% day 2 win percentage. I said percentage twice.
That's okay.
It's so interesting to me that it was able to convert so many decks from day 1 and then struggle so much in day 2. And it makes me wonder, like, were these players just really lucky in all their day 1 matchups? Were they just outclassed by the players in day 2? Sometimes Grixis Shadow just doesn't find its threat and loses the game because of that. Is that maybe what was going on here in droves because there's so many of these players?
Well, I have an idea.
What is it, Dave?
And this is only trying to intuit from the day 2 win rates and the day 2 metagame shares, but does Grixis Death Shadow struggle with humans by any chance?
Oh, I've heard it does.
It would seem like it. They're able to go pretty wide, and they have evasive threats as well. Not to mention what Reflector Mage can do, bounce a Gurmag Angler.
Yes, exactly. So I think those might be connected things, that in a wider field it did well, and then when all the humans decks made it through and Grixis Death Shadow kind of ran into that 70%, I mean, that might be part of the reason that the humans win rate on day 2 was so high, was that there were so many Death Shadows decks to play against.
Mm.
I mean, also humans can have a perfectly good game against Izzet Phoenix. I mean, Izzet Phoenix wants to flip a thing in the ice, and when you've got Thalia, Meddling Mage, Reflector Mage, it makes it tough to flip that thing. Flip that thing.
Yeah, I think Phoenix fits in a similar bucket with Death Shadow in that they're a little threat light or only have a few threats they're really trying to resolve. So if you can prevent them from sticking one or having one ever cast, they're sort of not doing anything.
They're just drawing cards, casting spells and drawing cards. Scry 1, scry 2, discard 1, discard 2.
Yeah. Serum Vision, pass.
I love when that happens.
Do you buy or sell the statement that Faithless Looting will be banned before Mythic Championship London? Shane?
I don't think it will be.
I think we've all been selling that, right? I mean,
I was buying it last week.
It's just too close to the MC. They're not going to do it.
I'm still on buy.
Really? You really think it's going to happen? Or are you just trying to be like devil's advocate here?
I'm trying to be contrarian here. I'm trying to stick to what I said last week, where everybody was like, the sky's falling is 25% of the meta and 75% of top 8. So no.
75% of top 8s. Oh, good Lord. This top 8, it's 6 Phoenix.
It's like Memory Jar.
Yeah, that's funny.
That's a callback for any old listeners.
All you old heads out there.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take a quick break now, and when we return, we're going to dive into the London Mulligan. We've been testing it in Magic Online and going to go over some results from Magic Online tournaments that had the rule in effect. Stay with us. London Mulligan. Noun. Draw 7 cards, then for each time you've mulliganed, put a card on the bottom of your deck.
So guys, Magic has a new big rule. A fundamental rule. A rule so big that they are willing to name it after a city.
Well, isn't the current one the Vancouver Mulligan?
Yes, and the one before that was the Paris Mulligan, and most people don't realize that because that was instituted in 1996. So in an effort to make Magic have less non-games, or so this is what Wizards of the Coast tells us,
quote unquote,
they've decided to experiment with a new mulligan starting with Mythic Championship London. And I suppose most of our listeners have heard about this. Stan just elegantly defined it above. Clearly, this type of rule change will have big implications for every format, but in particular, it has applications for Modern, where so many decks in Modern are reliant on drawing specific combinations of cards.
Yeah. Dave, you mentioned this as an experiment. Did they experiment with a Vancouver Mull, or was it just so obviously a good idea that it was just like, here's our new rule?
I believe they did experiment with the Vancouver Mulligan, and I believe they did it similarly where they experimented with it at a Pro Tour in Vancouver. And actually, the Paris Mulligan was also maybe not an experiment, but I think it started out at a Pro Tour in Paris.
Please, Dave, they've retconned all Pro Tours are now Mythic Championships.
They're retconned? Even in the past, I have to refer to them?
Yep.
I don't know who else was playing, but I was playing Modern when the Vancouver Mulligan was instituted, and there was not quite similar to this vibe, but people were not happy about it, and people were very worried what it was going to do to the format, and a big concern was that Scry was hard to remember, and it was a mechanic, and it wasn't inherent, etc. And I think we all agreed that the Vancouver Mulligan is fine. It's nice to scry away dead cards. It's nothing wrong with it at all. And obviously, I think this is a bit of a magnitude different in the change they're doing, but there was a similar perception at the time.
Yeah. I mean, again, just to underline what they're trying to do here is they're trying to reduce variance in opening draws so that people can get around getting mana screwed or can get around having bad draws or draws that don't do anything by feeling more confident in throwing back their hand and drawing a fresh 7 that they can manipulate in order to deal with the ramifications of the mulligan.
So anyone who's played Limited is going to realize how good this is going to feel in Limited, right? Because you can have a good number of non-games in that format and just never get anything going. Standard as well. But the speed and the power level of Modern is so different than those two formats that's why people, I think, including me, have an initial reservation to this, because there's so many decks that can operate so well with just a small number of cards in their hand that we really need to wait and see. And we're going to have a discussion about that in this episode, about what are the implications of the London Mulligan on Modern.
Yeah, and so I don't want to digress too much more into the abstract right now. I think that the main point is they instituted the Mulligan on Moto this week, starting last Wednesday, to give people a chance to play with it before the Mythic Championship and ostensibly to get more data about what it's like to have games with the London Mulligan. So why don't we dive into what it was actually like to play with it, what results we saw, what kind of decks we saw change as a result of it, because there has been, as Zach kind of alluded to and Shane alluded to, there's been a real kind of sky is falling vibe around this on social media, not just from you, but from lots of people, where it's been kind of like, the tweets that you see include things like people earnestly talking about how broken Modern's going to be after this. Other people saying it's incredible, it's going to fix the game. I mean, Ben Stark had a couple of tweets that were out about how much he was co-signing for this rule change.
Well, Ben Stark only plays Limited, right?
No, he has to play more than that since he's in the MPL, but yes, he is known as one of the greatest Limited players of all time. But, I thought that the best tweet that I saw about this over the weekend was from Allie Warfield, her tweet said, "Half of Magic Twitter, London Mulligans once. Wow, this is so amazing for the health of Modern. Other half of Magic Twitter, London Mulligans once. Holy hell, this is so broken, every format is ruined and the world is ending." I mean,
that sounds like magic.
She also does a great job of summing things up pithily quite often. I thought that was a very good one because, it sounds like a lot of magic when you put it that way. But also, in particularly with this, I mean, I did a lot of kind of trolling around on Twitter this weekend to see what people were saying, reading days and days back of tweets. And it really is that divided where people are kind of like best thing ever, worst thing ever.
Yeah, and I think we can strike a balance. I mean, that's the whole point of this conversation is what are we actually seeing, what are we actually experiencing, and what can we wait and see on?
Yeah. So I think the first thing we could talk about quickly was sort of the hype machine that started right after the rule launched on Wednesday. So immediately after the rule launched on Moto on Wednesday, there started to be kind of people posting on what decks they were going to try out on, streamers posting and other people just kind of posting about what things they were investigating, and sort of three themes emerged. One is the Cheerios list. SRAM deck plus Pure Steel Paladin. A lot of hype started to build around that deck, and it seemed like people were playing that on streams, playing that on their own kind of leagues. For people unfamiliar with that deck, it's a deck that casts a bunch of 0 casting cost artifacts with SRAM in play in order to kind of generate a bunch of tokens. It sometimes uses Monastery Mentor. It uses Pure Steel Paladin to draw cards.
Yeah, and then they basically, it's a really weird Storm deck. Then they just finish you off with a Grape Shot.
Right, so Monastery Mentor is sort of an alternate win con. And we talked a little bit about this deck last week as well, as it turned out, when we were reviewing Monastery Mentor. But in between the time that we recorded last week's episode and when we're recording this week's episode, Monastery Mentor went up $10 in price based on the hype.
Oh, that wasn't us?
No, I don't think it was us. Unfortunately.
Oh, no, it definitely was us.
I think it spiked before our episode even came out last week.
People anticipated our content.
Was that the Patreon? With the Patreon feed that we have for people?
Yeah, get your MTG Finance news early.
From the dive down.
Shut up.
Well, I mean, we are going to talk about another card that some of us bought low here in a second, and that card is Serum Powder. So Serum Powder, for people who aren't familiar with it, is a 3 casting cost artifact that taps for a colorless mana, and it has this text. Anytime you could mulligan and Serum Powder is in your hand, you may exile all the cards from your hand, then draw that many cards. You may do this in addition to taking mulligans.
Okay, I finally just got this card. It's exile all the cards from your hand. Okay. So basically you start with like 6 cards in exile. Yeah,
or 7 or whatever. And so it's been used already in Colorless Eldrazi to put the Eternal Scourge into exile so that you can cast it into play later. So basically it's a way of kind of bumping up the number of cards that you have in your hand by purposely putting cards into exile and then finding ways to bring them back into a zone that you can play them from. But
the deck you're talking about uses a different card, right?
So that's the deck that was already in Modern. Now, given the way that the London Mulligan works, there were a bunch of people posting on Twitter about a kind of Narset combo Reanimator list that used Serum Powder, Grizzlebrand, Narset, Goryo's Vengeance, Pull from Eternity. So basically, Relentless Assault, Fury of the Horde, like all of these different kind of like crazy cards that basically tried to cheat a card like either Grizzlebrand into play on turn 2 or Narset into play on turn 2, and then hope that you basically attack into getting to have her attack multiple times and get really giant sorceries from her triggered ability when you attack with her, like Omniscience and Enter the Eternity and things like that, or Enter the Infinite.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So it tries to get infinite combat steps. It tries to get Omniscience or Enter the Infinite into play so that you can pick up your whole deck and then cast all the cards from your deck and just kind of attack with her multiple times, basically. So this is the type of thing that was generating a lot of heat when people were talking about it, saying like, this is this crazy broken combo deck that's going to totally, I mean, some people I think were playing it for fun, but other people I think were legitimately scared that this is the type of deck that's going to come out of the London Mulligan being legal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does it
make sense? I mean, we'll find out. We definitely have a little bit of kind of information to go through here as a result of the weekend of testing.
I just can't wait to cash in on my copies of Narset Enlightened Master because I'm sitting on a whole lot of cons cards.
Yeah, I know. You got that cons cube.
I got that cons cube, man.
Yeah, so another card that spiked in value because so many people were interested in it over the weekend was Serum Powder. It popped all the way up to $20, apparently, which was another one of those indications of everybody wants to try this out.
Yeah, thanks for getting us in on that at like at $5 or $6, Dave, or $3 or $4.
Dave, you got me in on that at $2.
Yes, time to buy.
Time to sell. You mean?
MTG? Well, buy lists haven't moved yet, so keep an eye out for that. But anyway, so by the end of the weekend, by Sunday, after 5 days of playing the London Mulligan, it didn't seem on Twitter like any of the reactions were really calming down. Lots of people, London Mulligan is the worst thing I've ever seen. There's a great post that I saw from a player named Jacob Fusco, who posted a turn 2 kill with Amulet Titan where he was attacking with 3 Titans and had a 4th one in play, it looks like, on turn 2, which is incredible.
Yeah, he has 7 lands in hand, 7 lands on the battlefield, 3 amulets out, and 6 cards in hand.
And 4 Titans in play, I think, right?
I wish I could see his graveyard.
Yeah, I know, right?
All I see is 1 Summoner's Pact.
Yeah, but I think that it's interesting how much of the conversation around this has been just around Modern versus Standard and Limited, which is kind of what Shane was talking about a moment ago, but I think we'll dive into that a little bit later.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot wait to play Limited with this rule. I mean, the best thing about Limited is that it's limited. The worst thing about Limited is that you have 1 copy of a card in your deck, so you can't control your openers anywhere near as often. So it's really going to smooth out the number of non-games you have and make it less of an issue, I hope.
Yeah. So with everybody freaking out, and we kind of knew everybody was going to be freaking out, what we decided to do as a group was just play some games and kind of report back to people what we saw personally in kind of a cold, calculated, objective, dive-downy kind of way as we could. So all of us on the dive down decided to play different decks this weekend to try to test out what it really felt like to play with the London Mulligan in a competitive setting. We had already played some games with each other casually, but we'd never done it in a tournament and never done it when prizes were on the line. So I think it was this was a good way for us to test out what it really felt like to use the new rule.
I didn't get to play with you guys.
We offered to Skype you in, but you said that's not, and I quote, real Magic.
Just because it's over the internet.
I don't recall saying that, but I'll accept it. It sounds like something I would say.
Okay, so we're going to go around the table and give everybody a chance to talk about the decks that they played. So I'm going to start with Stan.
Yeah, I played Is It Phoenix, since that's the deck I have the most experience with in paper. And then I decided to do some leagues with Grixis Death Shadow as well. In part because it's a deck I want to learn more, but also because I thought a hand disruption-based deck could be worth experimenting with in the revised format.
Yeah, I loved that take that you had about the Mulligan a couple episodes ago when we talked about it, that Thoughtseize might get a lot better. I did see a couple of people also say the same thing on Twitter this weekend, by the way, that anybody playing black should have 4 Thoughtseize immediately. So how do those two decks feel to you under the new rule?
Is It Phoenix, I think, is going to fall into the camp of decks that don't benefit inherently very much by the rule change. I think largely because the deck itself doesn't have to mulligan that often to begin with. Unlike Tron that's trying to set up like a turn 3 combo, for instance, or other combo decks, Is It Phoenix doesn't really need to mulligan aggressively for threats, even though it's relatively threat light, because you have so much churn that in game 1, I can see people keeping the same 6s and 7s that they would with or without London Mulligan. It might just make a 6 slightly easier because you'll almost always get that land, that first land that you need. I think all of us are probably going to agree that game 2 and 3, the Mulligan gets a little bit more interesting and gives you more decisions to try to, make and sort through.
I mean, you're basically talking about looking for a certain sideboard card when you say that, right?
Basically, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that even about Is It Phoenix, which is sort of only medium known for like sideboard card impact. It's, I feel like Is It is much more about just kind of moving towards a more card advantage plan or a more aggressive plan or bringing in something to fight other people's hate cards.
It's a small mathematical equation that you do every time you sideboard and mulligan. I don't know, like some matchups.
Do you do a Sand or just does one do it?
I am one. I think Grixis Shadow was also my data isn't awesome because I don't have a ton of experience with that deck. I will say that game 1, I think Grixis Shadow doesn't change a lot in their mulligans because you're not really mulliganing aggressively in that deck to begin with, since you have a fair amount of churn as well. But the first turn Thoughtseize might be more valuable with GDS post mulligan than I think a post sideboard turn 1 Thoughtseize. One of the things that crossed my mind is if you're an opponent who's playing against Grixis Shadow and you know that you have to beware of Inquisitions or Thoughtseize, you might not be mulliganing as aggressively in games 2 and 3.
Yeah, although I don't know if that's changed, really. I think that's something you should have been thinking about before, and maybe now it's something to think about even more. But it's one thing that definitely I am bad at remembering when I know that I'm playing against a Thoughtseize deck is that, boy, I really should think about not mulling here so I don't get Thoughtseize down to 5.
Yeah, or even game 1 where you're like, is this hand somewhat Thoughtseize resistant? And if it's not, you can put yourself in a world of hurt, especially when mid-range is making a little bit of a comeback lately.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the basic gist. I'll probably touch back on some more specifics later on as we start to consider the decks we played against and some of the decks we saw in tournament results as well.
Yeah. So Zach, what did you try out with the new mulligan?
I did 3 leagues with Mono Red Prison and 2 leagues with Golgari Midrange, also the Rock.
Man, look at this guy grinding.
I know, I love it. Zach, get in there.
So I chose Prison because I think it is a deck that is going to benefit dramatically from this rule. Because it runs
dramatically. I want to hear this.
It runs main deck Chalice, and being able to jam a Chalice on 1, and it runs main deck Blood Moon, and being able to jam Blood Moon or Chalice on turn 1 is good enough for most decks, quite frankly. And being able to consistently get to that is really good. Mono Red Prison is a deck that, in my opinion, you mulligan to 5 or 6 pretty regularly, just because you draw hands that are 4 Chandras and 2 lands. Okay, you don't get to keep that. Or all your rituals and a mana and a Simian Spirit Guide. No, not keepable either. Because the deck has so much fast mana to it, you can draw the wrong half. So being able to go through and craft a hand is very nice.
So I'm just going to throw in the deck that I played here too, since Zach and I were sort of on similar plans, because I was playing Thalia Stompy. So I was also playing a Chalice of the Void deck, although I had the additional hate cards to try to play on turn 1 of Thalia and Leonid Arbiter. And I will say, as I've found over the last couple of weeks, people love to concede against this deck.
Yeah.
Like, it's insane how many concessions you get on like a turn 3 Thought Knot Seer, turn 1 Chalice. But I found similar things to be true, Zach, which is basically I felt pretty comfortable saying, like, I know that Chalice is good against this deck, and so I'm going to go down to 6 and just try to get a Chalice plus a Gemstone Mine plus a land, or a Chalice plus a Simian Spirit Guide plus a land, and just kind of like have my fingers crossed, because with so many options of hate cards, it just felt like it was usually worth it to give it a shot at least down to 6.
Yeah, Stan said that he felt like this mulligan was particularly good in games 2 and 3, and I feel like decks like Thalia Stompy or decks like Red Prison are almost playing a sideboarded game 1 because of the hate they have. So when you're able to mulligan and look for hate like that, it feels that much more powerful. I found that with Prison, especially if you're trying to mulligan for a fast man accelerated thing, I won't mind dumping my hand of 4 or 5 cards out entirely, just because of the way the deck works, where it's, all right, this is what I'm going to do. If you can beat this, then you beat my deck.
Yeah. I mean, I found that Thalia Stompy is a little bit different from that, where
Oh, sure.
I'm trying to save cards occasionally because I have to kill my opponent with something, but basically agreed, where it's kind of like, boy, if I have a 5-card hand where I can Chalice someone for 1 and then cast a Reality Smasher on turn 4 or somehow turn 3 occasionally, then that's definitely good enough to just take somebody down most of the time.
Yeah, Smasher's so good.
It's crazy. I forgot how much I missed this card. What about playing black-green under the Mulligan rule?
I feel like I really enjoy that deck. I've never played it in paper myself until I took it out for a league. I have friends that play it. I've talked to people about it. I've seen the deck many times. I know its game plan. Our own Shaniel himself is a rock man.
Yeah, he loves to like buy these decks and then talk about how bad they are. Though,
at least I play them. At least I play them a little bit, and then I can talk about how bad they are.
So it didn't feel as outright powerful as it did with Prison, because with Prison you're mulliganing for the hand that allows you to play 4 cards on turn 1. That's not what the Rock is doing. But I feel like there were a couple times where I would draw some hands where I go, ooh, this man is a little sketchy, but I feel a little better going to 5. And look at that. I'll keep 2 lands, a Thoughtseize, a Tarmogoyf, whatever. We're good here. And I feel like it just sort of smoothed out things. It wasn't as bombastic, but I feel like there were a lot more games that were games instead of, all right, Field of Ruin, all right, Hissing Quagmire, all right, your go.
Yeah.
So, Zach, that's awesome. Thank you for all that. And
of course.
But now Shane, I think, played the deck that consensus is starting to indicate that maybe benefited the most from the new Mulligan rule.
Because I haven't played Dredge yet. But no, I played a couple leagues of Tron. So, of course, I played Tron. I was going to split the difference between Tron and Dredge, but I decided I just wanted a larger sample size of Tron. And so I played a couple leagues. And what I think is it really benefits from the London Mull in a way that I think is going to add at least a few percentage points to its overall win rate, which might put it up to like maybe 54. I don't know. But even over the whole field is going to see a little bit of a benefit from the new rule, right? But I think Tron's going to see a little bit more. And this gets back to our Tron episode where we talk about the redundancy of the deck. And so there's many pieces of the deck that do the same thing, right? There's Expedition Map, there's Sylvan Scrying, there's Ancient Stirrings, there's the Tron pieces themselves. And so with the London Mulligan, you can just pitch these extra Tron pieces, maybe an unnecessary forest you happen to draw, any unnecessary threats. You just keep your path to Tron. And hopefully, if you're not mulling to like 3 or 4, you get the right threat for the job. So just as a quick example, so like my very last match I played today, it was a mull to 4. And the 7 that I got to see were two tower, a power plant, a mine, and a cairn, an ulamog, and a forest. So I would never see, that 4. I would never see the natural Tron and a cairn, right? But with that 4, I get to keep just the natty Tron, keep the cairn, hope my opponent doesn't cairn first because it was the mirror. They keep their natural Tron, but they have no threat. I play it I'm on the draw. I stick a cairn liberated. They immediately scoop.
Wow.
Yeah, easy breezy.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that Prison has in common with Tron.
Exactly. I was thinking the same thing when you were saying that, Zach.
That there's a select few cards that you're really looking for, and if, I'll keep a 4 that's like a land, Simian Spirit Guide, a Ritual, and a Blood Moon, and just go, hey, this is what I got, this is what I'm doing. And other times it'd be go to 4, 3 lands and a Blood Moon. Oh, I guess I gotta keep, right? Because I'm not going to see a better 3 than this. And I've had plenty of things like that where it's, all right, a 3-drop and 3 lands, I guess, because it's not going to get any better. But here it's, what if one of these lands was fast mana or anything like that?
For sure. Because, there's more redundant pieces to it, right? Because
exactly.
you're trying to accelerate you're trying to accelerate prison pieces out or threats out.
Exactly.
So ultimately, it didn't feel ridiculously better, but it did feel like over time, I'm going to win a few more games than I would have lost.
Interesting. Okay, well, let me ask you guys one question before we try to get some more objective data rather than just our anecdotes about playing, and that is, do you feel like you mulliganed more than you did previously just for value, even? Like you were more comfortable with just taking them all because you had a bad hand?
I mean, with Tron, you have to mull a ton, and that was kind of a benefit of this in general, is because I naturally mull so much with Tron anyways, it felt like I had much more of a chance to see a hand that would do something, especially like on a mull to 4.
Yeah.
Which I do surprisingly often, maybe a quarter of games I would go to 4. And I'm definitely much more apt to go from 5 to 4, just because, even though if mentally I know that I need to go to 4, right? But before it might be like, this is an okay 5, I'm much more likely to say now, okay, I'm going to still see 7 here and piece together a good 4 for sure. Yeah.
Stan, what did you think about playing on a deck more like Is It Phoenix or Grixis Death Shadow, where you're not trying to draw into something broken?
Right. So I think my decks are unlike Shane's in that they're not prone to mulliganing all that often. Shadow might be more prone to mulliganing just because it has fewer lands. It's got 17 and it doesn't have as much cantripping. I think my decks were those that basically would feel better when they have to mulligan, but that's where kind of the great equalization is happening with this rule change. I don't think that there are really strategies that are setting up potentially broken plays. Phoenix is somewhat different because it can set up a broken play, but that's not always your plan A. Your plan A is mostly to just go through the whole deck. So my opinion was that it felt better that you had better outcomes when you had to mulligan, but it wasn't the case that I felt like I wanted to mulligan more just for the heck of it.
It's fair. All right, so moving on from what we saw personally, there were a couple of events that we can take a look at the results of to see what kind of impact the London Mulligan started to have on an organized event of some kind. So there were 2 premier events on Moto this weekend in Modern. One was a Mox playoff. The other one was a Modern Challenge. Both of them are events that we kind of enjoy looking at in the breakdown section. Week over week, depending on what's going on with Grand Prix. They're typically pretty big or pretty high stakes events. So the Mox Playoff, I think, was a limited number of players that got invitations to it. The results that we have go out to 62 players. So it's a pretty small field, but I think that there's pretty high level players there. The challenge, of course, is usually a 9-round tournament. And so it's a big field of players in general.
Dave, I got to ask, which one of these are these both things you have to qualify for, or is it a challenge where you cash in QPs, or is it a playoff where you cash in QPs?
So just to draw the distinction between what the Mox playoff is and a Modern Challenge is. So the challenges are regularly occurring events on Magic Online. They happen every week. There's 4 different ones. There's a Modern Challenge, a Vintage Challenge, a Legacy Challenge, and a Pauper Challenge. They are open entry events. They cost 25 event tickets, so it has a pretty big entry fee. But it is kind of like a small SCG event or something like that, because they have a maximum of 672 players allowed to compete in each one. But I think that they sell out every week. And so you see these kind of players who can't really get out to organized events play them really seriously. So you often see the same players up towards the top of the results playing the same decks week in and week out, because I think they're people who have set aside their time on like Saturday to spend all day grinding the Modern Challenge if they can. For example, you'll see Gabriel Nassif streams the Modern Challenge just about every Saturday. The Mox events, on the other hand, involve some kind of qualification that I'm not as familiar with. And so you have to either cash in QPs to get into them or win a qualifier and then gain entry into a playoff from that. And so I believe that the reason the playoff only had 62 players is because this is sort of like a second round Mox tournament.
Yeah.
So the reason that we want to talk about the Mox playoff is because one of the players in the tournament, David Inglis, who competes under the name Tangrams and is at Tangrams on Twitter, tweeted out a table that had what he said, the quick and dirty stats from the Mox playoff, London Mulligan, 62 players. And so it had a breakdown of the entire tournament in this one tweet. Now, the thing that's really interesting, if you look at this table, is two things. He gave a win percentage. He also gave a number of decks within the field for each deck. The thing that's super interesting about those results is that the deck that stands far and above at the top of the field is Tron, with 13 pilots, where the next deck below that are Humans and Blue-White Control with 6 pilots apiece.
I think going into this rule change, Tron was a deck that was oft talked about by Shane and by other people that was going to immensely benefit from this rule change. So, and Shane mentioned, I think it was off mic, that if he was going to bring a deck to a tournament, it would be Tron. So if you're bringing a tournament-ready deck and it's one that's going to benefit from a mulligan change, I don't see any reason why so many people wouldn't bring it.
Yeah, it was 20% of the field, so I think that a lot of, like you said, a lot of people believed. Now, the problem is, if you look at it against win percentage, it only had a 52% win percentage.
Which is just about par for the course where Tron is right now.
Yes, exactly. So it didn't seem to benefit from the mulligan in an increased win percentage at all. It just had a greater meta share.
I think that meta share could also affect the results of other decks.
Oh, absolutely.
Which we're about to look at.
Especially in something that's only 60 decks, or 60, only 60 players.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that was interesting from this was that several decks in the field had 60% plus win percentages and more than one pilot. And those decks were Humans, Dredge, Grixis Death Shadow, Jund, and Affinity.
Yeah, those are all lists that I'd mentioned earlier. These are all perfectly cromulent decks to bring. These decks are going to win tournaments. So a deck that was sort of touted as very dangerous and new and people worried about what it could do, Cheerios, Ceramos, whatever you want to call it, playing those 0-drop artifacts and getting value for them, only showed up with a 44% win percentage here.
Among 3 pilots.
Yeah.
So is it easy to disrupt? Is it that they weren't exactly solid with it because it's, more of a fringe deck that they're taking for a spin? I don't think we have that information, but it didn't quite get there, it seems.
It definitely didn't break the format in its opening weekend, right?
No.
Right, which is definitely what some people were, I think, unironically worried about.
It's wild to me that, while it's not a ridiculous percentage of the metagame, it's still like the 8th place deck among the 62 players. It has brought out, the formerly super fringe deck Cheerios to this tournament.
Yeah. So the tournament was actually between Grixis Death Shadow and Dredge, with Dredge winning.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was pretty interesting that if you look at this, one of the first high-level tournaments with the London Mulligan, the meta was actually pretty standard. There wasn't really any new clear breakout deck. It does seem like there were some kind of large spikes in win percentages, but this is also a smaller field. And so it's hard to say what's the cause of that other than people getting lucky and just variance.
Yeah.
I do want to point out a non-joke Dark Horse contender in an 8th place Griselbrand, which is a deck that I think is typically on the fringes, but maybe a little soft to itself, a soft to hate, because that's a deck where you can mull to 5 and mull to 4 and be like, all right, well, scoop, I can't win this game anymore, right? But when you're able to go, okay, land, Simian, Spirit Guide, this is the perfect 4. It really benefits for what me and Shane were talking about, where if your deck really wants to be doing a certain thing very quickly, this rule change really helps you.
And I am going to predict, I'm going to do a called shot, that we are going to be pre-rebanning of Golgari Grave Troll levels of Dredge in the very near future.
Just because of the new rule change?
Yeah, because of the rule change. Yeah, it benefits. It's already so powerful, and it benefits so much from the London Mulligan. I'm really surprised that only 4 people brought Dredge versus 13 on Tron, because I think based on the math in the deck, I mean, Frank Karsten, in an article he posted just like maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, he said that, you know, the odds of a 4-card hand with Dredge being like, you know, 2 lands, a card draw spell, and a Dredge card goes up from 45% to 70% under the London Mull rule. So the sooner that people realize this stuff, the more they're going to be playing this deck.
Does having a card with Dredge in your opening hand, is it really that good? Is it that powerful in the deck that it's that mulliganing to 4 for 3 for 1 is really that worth it?
Are you saying, do you have to have a Dredge card on your opener?
No, he's saying, is it worth mulling all the way down to nothing to do it?
Yeah, well, because it seems like that's what you're saying, is that the percentage is high enough that you can go to, okay, 3, a Dredge card, I'm good. Is the deck capable of operating off 1 like that? It's that important?
Yeah, I mean, you can't operate without a Dredge card. I mean,
okay, so it's worth, you know, mulliganing to Oblivion and crafting the hand to get it?
Yeah, it's just like Tron. I mean, if you go back and listen to those 2 episodes, you just have to mull a lot with those decks, and it's just the bad part about them.
I think, Shane, correct me if I'm wrong, you have to mulligan to a Dredge card and an Enabler. Like, you need both pieces of that puzzle.
Yeah, the thing you want is the 2 lands, 1 that makes green, an Enabler, and a Dredge card.
Yeah.
The end.
Don't you want one of them to be red because your Enablers are red?
Well, all of your lands make red. Not all of your lands make green. Pretty much all of them make red.
So one of the things that I alluded to earlier was the presence of Tron in the room maybe affecting the performance of other decks. And I wonder if that might explain why Is It Phoenix, which had 5 pilots, shared a 40% average win rate across them.
I have a Phoenix question for my bird boys.
Baka?
Baka. When you sit down in your Phoenix and you see your opponent play a Tron land, what are the thoughts that are going through your head?
Abject
like
horror.
Legitimately, when you see Magic is hard. When you see that, what is going through your head in that moment? How are you changing your game plan?
Game 1?
Yeah, sure.
Game 1, you're not doing a ton to change it, I don't think, except to go as quickly as possible, because in Game 1 you don't have a ton of interaction that's good against Tron. The one exception is maybe you try to find like a Set Adrift if you're playing that, and maybe like bounce an O-Stone or bounce a Wormcoil. But Game 1, I think the answer is speed. Cold, hard speed. Game 2, you can side into a more controlling game plan because you do have Blood Moons, you do have a Braid. So it really, that's one of those matchups where the plan changes pretty substantially between games 1 and games 2.
Yeah. But Wormcoil is always hard for that deck to deal with.
Yeah, very much so. Wormcoil is only manageable if you can either bounce it with Set Adrift, or like maybe you can time a thing in the ice just right and bounce it back off that. Or, you know, maybe you've got a bunch of birds and your Pyromancer's Ascension's online, and then you can Bolt Snap Bolt for 16 damage that way, but it doesn't always work that way. So basically, although maybe Tron isn't the number one culprit for why Phoenix is going down in its win rate in this particular tournament, but maybe that explains why Wizards of the Coast R&D was a little bit reluctant to act on the Phoenix deck so quickly, because maybe they knew that the London Mulligan rule would affect the format enough that this one deck's dominance might, you know, let go a little bit.
See, I was thinking that, Stan, but also I put no faith in the powers that be. I think it's just a natural evolution of the metagame. The players have much more control over what happens in the metagame than the developers do.
All right, so let's move on to the Modern Challenge, which, as we were talking about a minute ago, is a much larger kind of field tournament. We think that it probably had a max of probably had a full capacity around 650 or so players.
That is crazy.
Yeah. I mean, these are the size tournaments that used to crash Magic Online, and hopefully they don't do that anymore. So this one was a little bit more kind of stable, I think, in some ways as well. But the thing that was really cool about this, at least from a personal perspective, was that this was won by a blue-red Kiki-Jiki. deck that really looked like a list straight out of 2015. This is one of those things that just happens in the modern challenges sometimes, where a deck kind of out of nowhere just wins it for inexplicable and unknowable reasons. And I think this was sort of another one that this happened. And I don't ascribe any of the fact that this deck won to the existence of the London Mulligan or not.
No, the challenges are so wild.
I would prefer to ascribe everything in these results to the London Mulligan, in that none of these decks besides Tron were trying to really do London Mulligan stuff in the top 8 at least, except for Kiki Jiki. I'm obviously being a little facetious when I say that London Mulligan had everything to do with Darth Kid's win of the modern challenge, but I mean, it is interesting that the first big tournament we have with this rule change, it's won by a combo deck.
Maybe not an Olin combo the way something like Ad Nauseam is, but being able to get, mulligan for the pieces you need to get to your combo is good.
Or mulligan for good control pieces based on what the matchup is.
Yeah.
Exactly. You get to flip-flop.
Yeah, you get to flip-flop.
But I do think it's interesting, the top 16, like you said, Stan, is a whole lot of decks that don't seem to be doing anything to exploit the London Mulligan. And so...
yeah, just one Tron deck.
Yep. Just one Tron deck. No dredge decks somehow in this top 16. And that's kind of it. One white-red prison deck, which is ostensibly doing Gemstone Cavern into Chalice kind of stuff.
I think it's interesting that the second place Controllers didn't run any Miracles, because I feel like Miracles are a card that benefit from this mulligan, because you're able to ditch the redundant... That's amazing, right? You wish that wasn't in your hand. So it's even better now, because now it's in your deck and you maybe get to shuffle and draw it later.
Yeah, maybe they're just too slow right now and aren't doing enough to really impact the field.
Yeah. So what do you guys think about the way that these kind of large events feel afterwards?
Yeah, I was surprised. That so many of the decks that we saw in these, top 16s are pretty much not benefiting from the London Mulligan, but it's also, stuff does take longer than I frequently think it's going to. Sometimes I think that things will change instantly, but they take much longer than I anticipated. So
yeah, the way changes take place in Magic, it's very rarely all of a sudden one day a deck is doing this and it's wild and people are talking about it. It happens, but that's more rare. It's more a slow change that happens over time, and then it's just, deck's always been doing this. This is the way it does things. I overall was more surprised by the lack of Ad Nauseam, because I feel like that's a deck that really was going to benefit from this, and something that I just have personally played a lot at local stores and have just really been like, wow, this deck is really close to just being the real deal. So not seeing anybody bring that out was pretty interesting to me.
Well, it's very likely that someone did. They just didn't do well.
Well, I guess that's true too.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely played against Ad Nauseam in my kind of leagues. And so maybe that's a good transition for us to talk really quickly about the decks that we played against personally. Was there anything that really stood out to you guys as a pattern in the decks that you played? I know that for me, the only thing that I saw was I kind of played a bit. It felt like I played a bit of extra Tron. The other decks that I played against were Chalice decks and Ad Nauseam and things like that. And I felt like those were there before, and maybe they're good under the mulligan, but it didn't seem like it. I didn't see any of these kind of Cheerios, Reanimators, any of those kind of decks.
I didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. The weirdest build I saw was a Mono Black Devotion in a league, but that I think some of them was just spice. The thing that I did notice is I played 32 games total. I'm still in the middle of a league right now, and I have seen 9 Chalice decks out of those 32 games.
Wow.
Right. And all of these decks were running Gemstone Cavern to try to excel it out.
Yeah.
So once again, this is anecdotal. This is 32 games played over a weekend. This isn't anything super sure, but I saw Forward Prison, I saw Thalia Stompy, and Mono Red Prison. And those Chalice on 1 is usually not very good against other Chalice decks, so got them. But there were a lot of them.
Yeah, I also played against the blue-white Spirits plus Chalice plus Thalia plus Meddling Mage deck, which is super weird, but I saw that as well. So I totally agree that I feel like there's a ton of Chalice decks floating around right now.
So that's interesting because I played 20 games across 4 leagues and I didn't see a single Chalice deck.
Same.
I did deal with a couple of Tron decks. I also dealt with a couple of Counters Company decks, which is another combo strategy. If we're thinking about combo strategies potentially getting better in the new meta, that's perhaps another deck that has sort of fallen out of favor over the last year or so, and maybe we can look at it as it potentially improves in the months ahead. Zach, I also played a mono black devotion deck, which I thought was pretty funny, as well as an 8-rack deck. And, piggybacking a little bit off of our brief discussion on GDS, 8-rack, which is just rife with hand disruption, seems like maybe this is another level 2 or level 3 play against a format that's starting to incentivize some decks to mulligan more aggressively.
Yeah, so you're thinking that because people will mulligan more aggressively than not, that they will mulligan down to just the key pieces they need, and you can snipe them out of their hand?
I think that is a theory worth testing.
I mean, he's also saying that it's easier to have someone start taking damage from the rack and Shrieking Affliction if they start with 5 cards.
I am saying that now. I wasn't saying that previously, but I wish I had, because that's a really brilliant point.
Nice. Close it down.
I was thinking that I played only 10 matches, so the sample size is low, but everything besides the 2 Obzon decks I played, so 8 of the 10, I think were all decks that capitalized on the London Mulligan. So, is that variance? Is that people testing things out? I don't know. There's a couple Tron decks, a Bogles deck, a Vengevine deck, Storm, the As Foretold Restore Balance deck, a couple of Amulet Titan decks. I think all of those decks definitely benefit in some way from the London Mull.
Yeah, so part of my decision for doing leagues with Is It Phoenix was in part to see how this deck, which doesn't necessarily benefit from the mulligan, can still fare against a field that potentially does. So maybe that's part of what we're seeing as well with players who are just doing the same deck that they've always done, is making sure that their strategies are still viable. And
I think the big thing that I would say about looking at all of this right now, between the tournament results, between our anecdotal results, is there's no new broken deck here yet. There's decks that existed before. There's decks that probably get better than they were before, or decks that probably get a lot better than they were before. That's harder to tell. There's things that might change the overall composition of the meta, especially when people complain online, or, we see a tournament where the 20% of the field is no longer Phoenix, it's now Tron. But it doesn't seem like there's anything that's fundamentally shifted this format into something completely different from what it was already.
It's also 1 week. I mean, I'm not trying to poo-poo your thoughts there, Dave, but I think that, you like me might be looking for changes to happen very quickly. This happens a lot when I look for cards to spike, where I'm like, okay, this card makes sense to me to spike, and it's a week, it's even 2 weeks, and it hasn't spiked yet. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I should have bought that, because now 3 weeks later it's jumping. And so I think that there's going to be some things that might be kind of obvious and people jump on, but some things might take a little bit of a while to percolate up.
Yeah. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about what we've seen and sort of what we've played with and what we've observed from tournaments, are we ready to talk about the types of things that we think make a positive improvement from the mulligan, the types of things that make no improvement, that kind of stuff?
I think we've got to.
For sure.
Okay. So what are some general kind of frameworks that you guys are going to be using going forward as far as what kind of decks the mulligan helps?
Dredge and Tron. And the reason of those is because we've already talked about this. They only need 4 good cards to operate. So one of the reasons I'm super hyped on these, not only because I generally enjoy playing them, Frank Carson a couple weeks ago wrote a really Frank Carson-y article where he outlined some math on specifically Tron and Dredge. And so getting an opening hand that guarantees in turn 3 Karn or Wormcoil goes from 16% under the Vancouver Mull to 33% under the London Mull. And with Dredge, if you want to aggressively mull to 2 lands, a card draw spell, and a Dredge card, that goes from 45% under the Vancouver to 70% under the London Mull rule. So when you can have your engine online with 4 cards 70% of the time, that's pretty darn good. I'm surprised it's not actually higher, to be honest.
Aren't you surprised that how little we saw Dredge in those big tournaments, though?
I am very surprised because, I don't know, I keep banging this drum like I'm like some crazy dredge player, like when I merely like it and respect it, but I think it's drastically underplayed based on all the statistics we have.
I just don't think anyone wants to buy into that deck right now, and it doesn't use a lot of cards from other decks. So,
but there's nothing to buy into. It's dirt cheap besides the red green fast lands.
Yeah, I mean the thing is, I think that I feel like there's something going on out there because people aren't even renting it online and playing with it in these big events. So I don't know what's going on there.
Maybe it's still a matter of no one respects it.
Could be.
I don't know.
No one wants to cast free lightning helixes.
Yeah.
They want to pay red and a white.
Right.
Like our foreparents.
So a couple other decks that we think are improved from this are Amulet Titan, of course. I mean, the source of the turn 2 kill that we talked about earlier from Twitter, which is, a powerful deck that can still do some really, really wild stuff. Prison decks that Zach and I have been very playing a lot lately, stuff that wants to get a turn 1 or turn 1 Chalice, a turn 2 Blood Moon, a turn 1 Thalia, turn 1 Leonid Arbiter, like all of these different things. I mean, Thalia is not really a prison deck, but you get what we're saying. It's the ones that want to play hate cards very, very early as a main plan.
I think what I'm really talking about when I talk about these things is the power of Simian Spirit Guide and how fast mana is really increased, or the power of fast mana is really increased by this mulligan. All the cards that we mentioned powering out on turn 1, these cards cost 3 mana most of the time, or Chalice costs 2. So the card that makes this all happen, the glue that holds together, is Simian Spirit Guide. And I think that fast mana, being able to consistently get it and consistently have these powerful, 2 or 3 drops on turn 1 is really what's making these decks good right now.
I agree, and that includes some combo decks as well that would be really good. I think under the new rule as well, including things like Storm, Counters Company, Ad Nauseam, Grishelbrand, Kiki Jiki, Jeskai Ascendancy. Who knows where that list ends? But it seems like any deck that's trying to put together a certain combinations cards is going to be better with a London Mulligan.
So one of the things that Shane mentioned earlier was that this rule change is going to benefit the whole field. And I want to touch on that a little bit more because I'm struggling to understand how that's possible. Since if some decks are going to get better and have improved matchups, doesn't that mean some decks have to get worse?
So every deck's probably going to feel a little bit better to play, but some decks over time are going to realize that they actually are a little bit better to play. And that's one of the reasons that WotC tries to hide data from us in so many ways, is because they don't want people to have the absolute knowledge on what the win percentage of a deck is. They want people to sort of feel it out, and that to evolve more slowly because of that. And so that's why things do take time.
Although with Channel Fireball sharing on this data now, I feel like there's certain aspects of that policy that might be changing. But the point is taken, I think, still, which is, the amount that decks benefit from this is going to be different.
Things can all feel better to play, but some decks are actually going to have a slightly higher win percentage, and some will have a slightly lower in correspondence to that.
I wonder if one of the outcomes we're going to see is that more decks are closer to 50% now, and that more games feel like a coin flip. Because if everyone's operating a little bit more consistently, and I want to mention, I'm kind of thinking about this through the lens of Izzet Phoenix, which is a deck that's been powerful and dominant because of how consistent it is and can beat up on the decks that are stumbling a little bit, even though, by and large, Phoenix is super beatable. If everyone is being more consistent and if everyone is executing their plan a turn or two sooner, and we often talk about Modern as a format of ships passing in the night, do you guys think that maybe we're going to just see kind of an evening out of a lot of strategies altogether?
So Stan, I think it's an interesting question. I tend to think that if we have win percentages move towards 50% for decks themselves, that it just gives more. This is the type of rule that gives more players a chance to outplay each other in various ways. And so I think that this mulligan to me actually feels pretty skill rewarding, realistically. And so it's trying to lower variance, it makes players that are better hopefully have better win percentages based on the decks that they're playing. Now, I don't know if that's going to bear out.
One of the first things I heard from someone that really caused me to look at Magic more competitively in a different way was how to get good at Magic is to minimize variance or minimize luck and maximize skill. And I think that's really what Dave is saying with this, is that with something like this, you have less non-games like we talked about, where you draw a 5 that's unkeepable and go to a bad 4 that you just have to keep. Here, you're able to craft it a little better and go, okay, now I'm playing a little mini game right now where I'm looking at this 7 and deciding what the 4 that gets me to victory is, as opposed to grabbing a 4 and going, well, all right, keep. And I think that's another thing that really is, you're minimizing luck because you are looking at 7 instead of 4 and you're maximizing your skill.
I think that's a great point, Zach. I also think, Stan, that Modern is really close to 50% already.
Yeah.
I think the biggest swings we see are maybe like 45 to 55. And that is a metagame that any competitive card game would love to have.
So does that sound like a format you guys want to play in? One where it's more skill dependent and more mini games? Or do you want to have a little bit more variance where people can get lucky and beat a better opponent?
I prefer a metagame that's a little more skill-based just because I've moved to a more skill-intensive deck with Prison, and I want to feel like me learning these lines and me trying to learn the metagame is being rewarded. I don't dislike variance, but when it feels good, it feels really good, and when it feels bad, you go 0-4 one night, and then you get to go home because you just ran cold, and that's how Magic works sometimes. So I think it's supposed to be more of less, that's how Magic works sometimes, and more, hey, if you're smart, this is still going to be a game.
So it feels like the discussion is moving pretty quickly to the kind of ultimate question about this, which is, we've had some time to look at a couple of really initial results from big tournaments. All of us have tried to play a bunch of games over the last 5 days in order to see how we felt about the new rule. So my question to everybody is, to close up this discussion, is are you hopeful that they keep this rule even when it comes to Modern, or do you think that they should go back to the Vancouver Mulligan?
I like it. It makes Mulligans feel a little better. It makes them also more interesting too, especially in game 1 when you don't know what's important if you're playing an interactive deck. So what we mentioned earlier about how this may be a change that benefits more skill-intensive players, that sounds kind of appealing to me. Not to mention, like, the number of non-games that I've had because I've had really bad luck from drawing up a crappy 5 and then a crappy 4 and then having to keep a bad 3. Like, if the rate of that goes down, then I think people in general will be happier, especially at the LGS level.
Stan, I think that you maybe underestimate a little bit about how the competitive metagame then trickles down to the LGS level and, like, of course, like regional tournaments, right? I think that if this ultimately creates maybe a less healthy or a less balanced competitive metagame, it's a net negative to the format, right? But ultimately, I think it still remains to be seen. The percentages that Karsten mentioned for the decks people really don't like to play against, like Dredge and Tron, they are significantly higher to have a successful hand post-Mull. But I think it really is going to take a little while to feel itself out. But I am hopeful that everything is balanced.
Zach, what do you think?
I did feel happy with it. I had a good time, and I didn't feel like I was frustrated or felt like I had to deal with any more nonsense than typical. And I didn't feel like I had a lot of games where it's, of course you have that. Of course that happens now. All right, concede. It felt like games were still normal and fine. Maybe even we had more games than non-games. I really think that playing with Gemstone Caverns has made me a little better at putting back cards, and I just get to play like 3 Gemstone Caverns every game now, in a way, but without the payoff.
Yeah, I mean, for my part, I do worry a little bit that there's going to be broken cards in Modern that are going to need to be fixed really quickly, and I think that, the Mythic Championship might be the best place for us to see how that stage evolves.
Yeah.
But the early indications are that there isn't anything that's happened quite yet, at least as far as bringing a new menace to the format. It might make some decks that already exist a little too much, but I think ultimately, for me playing with it, it felt pretty good, and I likely, right now, I'm kind of a pro keeping the Mulligan, depending on what happens at the Mythic Championship.
I am concerned about the legality of Simian Spirit Guide. I just mentioned how good I think it is. I don't think it'll be emergency banned or anything like that, but I think that is a card that gets particularly good with this, as I mentioned earlier. So I would like it to be around. I think it's a fine card, but I could understand that maybe a different deck comes along and just does some consistent turn 2 nonsense or something.
Yeah, agree. That's definitely one of the problem cards that we should be keeping an eye on.
Can we agree that it would be a good thing for Modern if, let's say, nothing so broken and dominant as like an Is It Phoenix or a KCI happens again, but we start to still see new decks emerge, and like maybe Grishelbrand starts to eat up a little bit more of the meta share just because it's, you know, a turn or two or three more consistent and becomes a viable strategy.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a quote-unquote best deck, right? And I don't think too many people have a problem with that. I think it's when it posts enormous meta shares.
And this is all going to be shaken up with Modern Horizons anyway.
Exactly. We don't even know. That's going to be so much fun, guys.
Yeah. So the real deal for me here, though, and that I feel like it's going to be implemented in Modern. So I'm extremely happy with the fact that it doesn't look like from early stuff that there's something that's particularly broken. I'm sure that'll change over time as people figure out what to do and how to abuse the rules, and maybe it only goes so far. But the fact is, these felt like better, more balanced games of Magic in general, all things aside. And so I feel like the concept of the rule is pretty good for the game. And so if it's good for the broad number of players in the game, we as a Modern community are just going to have to go with it. And the Modern format is going to have to change to adapt to this rule. I don't think the rule is going to adapt to maintaining the Modern format.
Yeah, you're right, Dave. Sad but true.
Fair, but tough.
I wasn't expecting quite so much consensus there at the end, but okay. End it.
All right, guys. Thanks for that interesting dive into all things London. I don't know about you, but I feel a bit more British, don't I? Yeah. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we are going to take some called shots about the MC in London, the namesake for the Mulligan rule. Stay with us.
So have any of you all actually been to London? Because I have not, and I really want to.
I've been twice.
Twice? Look at this guy, world traveler.
A couple times. So one time I've actually even flown over downtown London in a helicopter for a photo shoot. Well, the photographer hung out the side of the helicopter, and we just watched a lovely sunset while we took pictures.
What in the world are you talking about?
This is my glamorous day job that you guys believe is super boring. I actually travel the world, do photo shoots, do all kinds of crazy stuff.
That can't be true.
It's 100% legit.
Was the photographer hanging on to the helicopter by just their hand?
No
or
harness.
Did they have some kind of system of ropes?
The adrenaline has to be pumping.
He was just hanging down from the legs below it, and no, he was strapped into the open door. We flew over St. Paul's Cathedral, the London Bridge, and the Gherkin, kind of back and forth in a triangle, getting shots with like a super wide fisheye lens, doing all kinds of city shots. Basically, it was wild. I sat up in the front with like a headset on. Yeah.
And then did he turn to you and say, David Harbarger, in 2019, there's going to be a Mulligan rule change. We're going to talk all about this.
He did. He was like, "Vision. This is a vision of Mulligan's future."
His eyes were rolled back in his head, just the whites exposed.
Yes.
I'm really upset that you waited until now to tell me that you met a man with future information. This would have been helpful for the past 4 months we've been doing this, but you know.
This was also during a time that I wasn't playing Magic, so it was really weird to me that he wanted to talk to me about Mulligans.
A dark timeline.
I don't know what you're saying.
What do you mean?
So guys, I've been thinking a lot about the Mythic Championship, I'm not even close to playing at this thing, and I've like level 4'd it already. Okay, but I want to know what you guys think.
You brought your transformational sideboard?
75, tweak it.
Tough for anything to break out of. I'm still going to be looking for Is It Phoenix to do good. I guess is what I'm saying here is that if they're not going to make any changes, I feel like that's just kind of where it's at. I don't know. What do you think, Stan?
Yeah, my eyes on the bird. I just want to see how dominant it could be, and well, it's clear that Wizards is sort of waiting on the results of this tournament to kind of decide what they want to do with this deck. So that's where I'm at. Based on my 4 leagues, I didn't see enough, on Magic Online to feel like it's going to make a huge change on the format. And I think most players are basically just going to come in with the deck that they know best.
But don't you guys think that people might just be like, okay, half the room is going to have Izzet Phoenix, so I'm going to bring maybe Dredge and Tron, which takes advantage of the London Mulligan and has a good Phoenix matchup.
Yeah.
I am not a pro player. I have not played in anything bigger than a local 9-round tournament. I don't know if you're trying to outguess and out-hate the meta at one of these, especially when there's so many weird shakeups. I think that it might seem better to stick with what you know and have a cohesive sideboard plan than go in trying to aiming to beat a deck that might even be that well represented.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, one other thought that I had here was that there's a player named Rich Shea who is sort of a well-known vintage and legacy player who was tweeting about the London Mulligan over the weekend, and he mentioned that basically what he said was the main takeaway that he felt about the London Mulligan is that it's kind of like giving people access to cantrip mana bases or cantrip decks in decks that never had access to that kind of consistency before. And so I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about why maybe Izzet Phoenix might return to the pack a little bit, is that people might rise up as far as consistency goes. And so something that occurred to me is that I kind of feel like Tron or Amulet might also be likely contenders for this particular.
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch on something that we've talked about in the past, where it's something that I've struggled with and struggle to this day, where you maintain that Izzet Phoenix is a quote-unquote fair deck. So if going by that logic, it's a fair deck. It's just a little more consistent. Bringing other decks up to the level of consistency should make it more even, because it's not doing broken things like dredges like we talked about, where it's dumping all these creatures into play. It's just having consistent, evasive threats. So if you bring up other decks and all of a sudden they're more consistent with their removal or their own threats, well, maybe all of a sudden Izzet Phoenix isn't just the poster child anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my feeling. I mean, I just feel like if every deck is doing its thing faster or more often, then, Phoenix doesn't have, especially in game one, the tools to disrupt people that profoundly. So if the whole format's getting faster, then I suspect that Phoenix probably won't be the best deck at MC London.
What I think is interesting about this MC is, so like typically in standard MCs/PTs, you might see like 5 or 6 decks make up 70 to 80% of the metagame. And you would say in Modern, that's pretty crazy, right? Because the metagame is typically so wide. I think perhaps due to the London Mull, we might see a consolidation of strategies, especially because there is such a number one deck in the format. So that's, I think, is going to cause people to think like I am, which is like, okay, if people are bringing, if 20% of the room is Phoenix, they're going to bring the next deck, and then I'm going to bring the deck that beats that. So I think that there is a hole in the metagame to be filled, where someone could build a deck that has a really good main deck and sideboard that can maybe beat 70% of the room or have a good matchup against 70% of the room. And I'm going to do a little bit of a called shot and say I think that a very tuned Spirits deck is going to top 8 this MC. Or top 16. Top 16.
Chalice in the side or no?
I can't predict what the tuning will be.
Chalice in the side or no?
Wow, man, you're really putting me on the spot here, Zach. I'm just gonna say Spirits top 16.
One?
I'm gonna say one Spirits top 16, which is a lot for a Spirits nowadays, in my opinion.
Yeah. All right. Well, I like this called shot, but I think in order for us to bring it close to this segment, I'm going to ask everybody to pick one deck that they think will be in the top 4.
Ooh. Dave, you go first then.
I am going to pick Humans with Chalice in the side.
Mm-hmm. I like it. It's doing well. Doing very well right now. Very, very consistent deck. Going to do well.
A very honorable choice, Dave. Thank you.
Yeah, Dave, I'm a little upset that you said that because I was going to predict Humans as well. Though maybe not specifically Chalice in the sideboard, but I think Humans is such a consistent and powerful deck that it's almost underplayed right now. And a lot of the strategies that I see as potentially benefiting from London Mulligan, to me, they don't seem to have really strong Humans matchups necessarily.
Yeah.
So I think Humans is a very safe bet.
Do you have your own pick, or do you just want to piggyback onto Humans and agree with that one?
I mean, I think Tron will probably do it.
Okay.
Zach.
So I think Phoenix is the safe bet, and I don't make safe bets. I make risky, high-interest, payday bets.
This is our red mage, Zach.
And I think we're Prison.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
I think that it's a deck that is drastically scaled to the power and skill of the player. And if you're playing at this, obviously you're a very good player. And I think it rewards someone with a very deep meta knowledge. And you also, you need to get lucky in certain situations, but that's where this mulligan really helps, right? Where you have all these pieces in the sideboard, you have all these unique interacting prison pieces. So if you know that you need Chalice on 2, need it on turn 2, you can dig for that. And you can go to 4 pretty reliably for that. So I think that we're going to see some super hot, amazing prison play. And who knows, maybe in a first place win.
Zach, I'm on board with your guess. I would not bet against you. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to guess Spirits, just to be weird, just to be rogue. I think a really good Spirits player can top 4 this tournament. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be Dredge, but I'm going to call out my old buddy Bant Spirits and friend of the show Steve, who put this little nugget in my brain. I think a Toon Spirits list is going to do really well this MC.
Okay, I love it. So our top 4, the dive down top 4 of Mythic Championship London is We're Prison, Humans, Spirits.
Is it
Phoenix, and what did Stan pick?
I picked Tron, but we've definitely just listed 5
decks.
Tron.
Tron. So we got 5 decks. Yeah, so our top 5.
How'd we get 5?
Because you threw Is It Phoenix in it, even though nobody picked it.
I didn't throw that in.
You literally just said that.
You literally just said that.
Oh, sorry. I thought someone else did. Okay.
That's okay. We're keeping all this. This is all good. All right, so there's our top 5. So
I mean, let's just throw Dredge in there since it's positioned well under play.
That's my actual
so we got
pick.
6.
And we're just so close. Yeah, we're just so close to naming a combo deck, which is just combo. Put a category on there. We're good.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, there's your dose of wild speculation.
With a little bit of background on why.
A week before it's too early, or a week too early.
No, we have more important wind downs next week.
Yes. So. Next week we'll talk about spoilers, we promise, guys.
All spoilers all the time. We're waiting for the complete spoiler.
All right, everyone. That wraps up this week's show. Thank you to my co-host for a really good one. Listeners, I'm sick as a dog right now, so this is the best I felt in a couple days.
Sorry, Stan.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use iTunes, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or pick our brain on something in Modern, you can tweet us at TheDiveDown, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you see us on Reddit, feel free to send us a message there as well. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And don't forget, you can do a survey for our future Patreon. The link to that is in the show notes of this episode, on our Twitter, or on Reddit. So until next week, get out there and mull. 2, 5.
I think you should just tread carefully because Richard Garfield is in my home. So
yeah,
take that as you will.
I'd like to talk with him about how much I miss his excellent podcast that was called Three Donkeys. And you guys, any of you ever heard that? It was great.
No.
It was about game design.
Was that the one all about board games?
Yeah, it was really good.
I've listened to that one. Yeah.
It's about
it was about games that he was working on and games that he was sort of like conjugating on, like along with Scaff Elias was on it and one other game designer that he worked with. It was a really good podcast, but it was like 10 years old. Good digression.